Hey guys, what is up? So, kind of against my better judgment, I decided I would weigh in one more time. I wanted to talk about a specific glitch, the Estus cancel. This will be the very last I have to say probably about any of these glitches in the game. I'm sure many of you are tired of hearing about it, but I thought I had a few more interesting things to say, things I really haven't heard other people talk about. Obviously, there will be some ground here that's probably been pretty well covered already, but hopefully the new insights will help justify some of the time that we spend talking about this. So let's go ahead and get started. So I want to make something pretty clear here at the beginning. Even though I do think that Estus cancel is a very broken sort of mechanic, that's not the same thing quite as saying I don't think anybody should use it. In fact, I don't actually feel that way, that nobody should use it. I do think there are times where it is appropriate to use it. I'm going to cover some of that later in the video, but I just want to be clear that me talking about a mechanic that I think is bad for the game and shouldn't be in the game, that should not be construed as saying that people shouldn't be using it or you're a bad person if you use it. I know there's been a lot of sort of back and forth in the community lately. Some people have been very vocal in saying they don't care for the Estus cancel, and other people say that they do, and there's been a bit of mocking back and forth, and I'd like to get beyond all that, and I just simply want to explore the mechanic and look and ask, is it a good mechanic for the game, rather than getting into calling various people out. It's not productive. I've got friends on both sides of the position, and we should be able to look at an issue and separate it from the people that have an opinion about it. So let's talk about exactly why I think Estus cancel is broken. And interestingly, I think one of the reasons it's so broken is precisely because people don't think it's broken. You know, people look at the bow glitch, and anyone that uses the bow glitch knows that it's broken as hell. And that's why its use is actually pretty limited. I think, you know, even people that do use it realize they're kind of being an ass when they do. Now, if you use it as a retaliatory measure because somebody else is using it, no, I think that's fine. But you know, somebody who's kind of like the first mover with these sorts of glitches, they understand that it's kind of beyond the pale, and so the use is limited. But Estus cancel, precisely because people don't think it's broken, feel pretty free to use it in a lot of circumstances, some that are okay and some not so okay, but I think that's where a lot of the brokenness comes from. But beyond that, the fundamental reason I think it's so broken has to do with how the game balances healing. And in order to really understand this, I'd actually like to take a bit of a trip through some of the Souls games and help everybody understand the sort of relationship between healing speed and how that affects invaders, phantoms, and hosts. So if we start out and we look at a game like Dark Souls 1, and I'm talking about the original Dark Souls 1 here, not the remaster. And we'll actually talk about the remaster as well, but the first Dark Souls 1, there is a huge disparity in healing ability, at least on paper, between the host and, let's say, an invader. The host can have tons of Estus, I think up to 20, depending on how much they've kindled a bonfire. They can have their Estus upgraded, and the invader gets no Estus at all. Now, of course, they can heal through means like humanity and blessings. I think the intention was that those sorts of mechanics would be very limited in invasions. Now, of course, that's not actually how it played out. But from a design perspective, and that's what's important here, is what From was trying to design, the experience they were trying to design, was a huge disparity in Estus between the invader and the host. And then if you look, DS2 was pretty much the same way. And then interestingly, Bloodborne changed all that. Bloodborne gave you almost parity in healing items. Now, why would they make a change like that? And the answer, I believe, is related to the speed with which you heal and the ease with which those heals can be punished. As everyone here probably knows, in Dark Souls 1, if a host tried to Estus anywhere near an invader, it was virtually a death sentence because they would get locked into the animation and the invader would come around and backstab them. And precisely because healing was so able to be punished, it made sense to have a wide disparity in healing measures. In Bloodborne, on the other hand, healing was very, very fast and difficult to punish. We'll talk about some of those punishes here in a minute, but it was very difficult to punish. So it made sense to have near parity in healing items. This is not an accident. This is definitely a deliberate design choice. Then we move into Dark Souls 3. And what happened in Dark Souls 3? Healing was reasonably fast, and people coming from Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 clearly saw it as too fast, but it was definitely not nearly as fast as Bloodborne. And so it was a sort of a compromise heal speed, and so there was a compromise difference in Estus. You got half the host Estus, technically half of your own Estus, but in practice it ended up usually being half of the host Estus. So they were trying to balance the ease of punishing the Estus with how wide the disparity was in Estus allocation. Now, one thing that I find really, really interesting, though, is in Bloodborne, even though, so healing was very fast, and so as a result, every Phantom, every host has the same number of healing items. But I think precisely because heals were so fast and so difficult to punish, that they added a new mechanic, which was essentially the ability to parry heals. From recognized that because it was so difficult to punish these, that they had to add another way of potentially punishing heals. And so it added this new interesting sort of meta game where if you could predict your opponent's heal, you could punish it. Now, I understand some people think, or maybe were even able to punish these on reaction. That's not usually the case. Even if the game allows you to, the latencies involved are usually such that, at least for me, it was something that I would do on prediction, but it's at least there, and it's in somebody's head that when they heal, they have to be thoughtful about how they do it, because they could end up getting gun parried and then riposted for a huge amount of damage. Bringing us all back to DS3 then, you can see where the problems are. The a properly done Estus cancel, and I haven't actually counted the frames. I thought about doing it, but I don't have the time. But if you look at an Estus cancel compared to a Bloodborne heal, I believe an Estus cancel is actually faster than a Bloodborne heal. Could be wrong about that, but they're, I would say, probably of comparable speed. But there's no punish for an Estus cancel. And that's one problem, there's no punish. The second problem is because the heals are much faster now, a properly balanced game would change the Estus allocation. Like if the designers had built the game from the ground up with heals to be that fast, they probably would have gone the Bloodborne route and given the host and the invaders and the phantoms access to the same amount of Estus in order to keep it fair. Because the faster the heals are, the more the Estus allocation matters in terms of the difference in how much it affects the outcome. And anybody that's ever invaded a host with a full set of Estus, and the host is Estus canceling, knows this to be true. It's virtually impossible to win in that situation because you can't punish their heals. You can be a lot better than the host, but not better enough to overcome such a huge advantage. I thought, one of the most interesting kind of natural experiments with this was kind of revealed in the Dark Souls Remaster. And I think what happened was the folks that did the remaster came along and they looked at some of the elements of DS3 and they thought, well, let's bring those elements into DSR. We'll increase the summon limit and we'll bring in the same sort of weapon matchmaking, and then we'll bring in the Estus mechanic. And that ended up, in my view, being an enormous mistake because they didn't really think through the consequences of what would happen. They pulled in elements of DS3, but because it doesn't have all the elements of Dark Souls 3, it fundamentally upsets the balance. And what ends up happening as a result? Well, you get these big ganks that spawn trap you, and then even if you're able to get a phantom at really low health, you can't pursue him and the gank protects him while he heals. You, of course, do not receive similar protection, and so even though as an invader you may have all that Estus, in practice it ends up doing very little for you. On the other hand, if you invade a solo host, because you can run off to the mobs and heal, and it's very dangerous in Dark Souls 1 to pursue an invader into the PvE. That's something you can do much more safely in later games, and that also I do not think is a mistake. I think that was a balancing effect. I think part of the reason the game DS3 moves so much more quickly than the older games is to make that sort of invader play much more dynamic, where it can take place throughout the level rather than in DS1 where it would be absolutely insane for a host to venture into the PvE and try to manage an invader at the same time. The backstab mechanic alone makes that almost completely impractical to do. So last of all, I want to deal with what I see as some of the common objections to my line of thinking. The first objection, which I think is probably the most easily done away with, is, well, it really doesn't give me a big advantage. Estus cancel, it's really not that big an advantage. And to which I say, then why spend the time learning it? Why bother using it? It's precisely because it does give you an advantage, and potentially a very sizable one, and that's exactly why people use it. But I think probably a more serious objection is, well, what if I use it against a gank? How is that really unfair? And I actually agree. I think, at meta, I typically don't use Siegs, for example, but if I were to invade at meta, I would absolutely use Siegs, mostly because everyone else is already using them, and I would end up just putting myself at a big disadvantage. Similarly with Estus cancel, but even if a gank is not canceling, I think the invasions at meta have evolved to the point they're so far beyond what the game designers could ever have dreamt. And I do think that potentially an invader Estus canceling at meta is actually contributing to fairness rather than unfairness. The problem is, of course, we don't get to choose who Estus cancels and who doesn't, and ganks, by their very nature, almost by definition, seek to obtain every advantage that they can, fair or not. And so, of course, ganks are going to Estus cancel like everybody else, and then the net result is everybody's collectively worse off because it's made these fights so much less fair and these hosts so much more difficult to kill. So I guess the point I'm really trying to make is, if you want to use Estus cancel and you think it's contributing to the fairness of the situation, that's fine. But you should just be mindful of when and how you're doing this, right? Just like I don't have a problem with Siegs at meta, but when I see invaders at like solo level 35 using Siegs, I kind of have to shake my head a little bit, just because I think that advantage is so substantial, and these are usually players that are pretty twinked out to begin with. And so too with Estus cancel, I think it probably depends on the situation. In some situations, certainly it could contribute to overall fairness. I'm just looking at the mechanic overall and how it contributes to the ecosystem. I think the ecosystem's better off without it. At the same time, I don't really criticize anybody for using it. I understand the perspective. If it's in the game, it's fair game. That's not my belief, but at the same time, I understand why people think that, and I think it's at least an internally consistent way of approaching it. So again, don't see this as an attack on anybody. And I just ask that the community be maybe a bit more tolerant of people that don't think the same way that maybe you do. And I think there's room for everybody to have a variety of opinions about a lot of different things. So thanks for tuning in, guys, and take care now.